Is it possible that there exists an ancient mystery that lies behind the events of modern times that determines the rise and fall of the stock market and the economy, the rise and collapse of nations, the destruction of empires and superpowers, a mystery more than 3,000 years old, and yet that determines global cataclysms, the timing of world wars, the atomic age, the Cold War, the attack of 9/11, and more? Could a mystery revealed in a Middle Eastern mountain ordain the rise of America and what may be its coming fall? Could this ancient mystery given to a nation of shepherds be so precise that it has ordained and determined the timing of the greatest collapses in Wall Street history, down to the year, the month, the date, and the hours? What if we could know the future? Could there exist a mystery going back to ancient times that's been affecting, even molding our lives from the days we were born? From events of global proportions to the state of our bank accounts, our past, our present, and our future. And what does it foretell concerning what is yet to come? What is this mystery? It's called the mystery of the Shemitah. It began in The Harbinger, the New York Times bestseller written by Jonathan Cahn.
The Harbinger is the revealing of a phenomenon that first appeared in ancient times, in the last days of the Kingdom of Israel. It took the form of 9 prophetic signs, warnings, that foretold a coming destruction. These same 9 harbingers are now reappearing on American soil, in the same precise detail, warning of a coming national calamity. In addition to these 9 prophetic warnings, the Harbinger contains a series of mysteries. One of these mysteries and chapters is entitled The Mystery of the Shemitah.
That chapter caused a frenzy of attention and speculation concerning the future. As Cahn delved further into the Shemitah, its mystery grew ever deeper, ever more expansive and stunning. It touched virtually everything, from Wall Street to world wars, to events of the 21st century. The new revelations resulted in the book entitled The Mystery of the Shemitah, which, as with The Harbinger, also became a New York Times bestseller from the first week of its release. What is the mystery of the Shemitah, and what does it have to do with your life? To find the origins, we must go back over 3,000 years to a Middle Eastern desert. It begins on Mount Sinai.
The nation of Israel has just come out of Egypt, and its leader Moses has ascended the mountain to receive the revelation of the Torah, or the law of God. In this revelation comes the law of the Shemitah.
It says this, "And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is a year of rest for the land." Leviticus 25.
As every 7th day was a Sabbath day, a day of rest, a day to be kept above the others as holy to God, so every 7th year was a Sabbath year, a year of rest, a year to be kept above the other years as holy to the Lord. The 7th or Sabbath year was called the Shemitah. During the year of the Shemitah, the land would rest. There would be no sowing, no reaping, no plowing, no pruning of the vines, no gathering of the olives, no winnowing, no threshing, nothing. It was a Sabbath for the land. Further, during the Shemitah, there was to be no buying or selling or marketing of the fruits of the land. So the Shemitah had a massive effect on the nation's economy. It was a year of economic cessation. It was to be a year in which the nation would turn away from worldly pursuits and turn to God. A year to declare the Lord's sovereignty over the land and over their lives.
The Shemitah was to remind the people that the land belonged not to them, but to the Lord. And all the blessings of the land, all the blessings of their lives, their well-being, their sustenance, came from God. And without Him, those blessings would cease. But the Shemitah touched more than just the land.
On the last day of the 7th year, something unique took place. The ordinance came from the end of Moses' revelation on Mount Sinai. It's found in Deuteronomy 15.
At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts, and this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release.
The end of every 7 years was taken to be the last day of the last Hebrew month of the civil year, the 29th day of the month of Elul, or Elul 29. On Elul 29, all the nation's debts were wiped away. All credit was wiped away. Everyone who owed a debt was released from that debt. And everyone who was owed a debt had to release that which was owed. So once every 7 years, on that day, Elul 29, at sunset, the nation's financial slate was wiped clean. Its financial accounting of debt and credit nullified. Elul 29 was the day of nullification or remission. The word remission or release was the Hebrew Shemitah. So Elul 29 was the day of remission, and the 7th year was the year of remission. In the Shemitah, both the land and the nation's debts were released. So the Shemitah transformed the nation's economic and financial realm. Now, even though the Shemitah was meant to be a blessing to Israel, it possessed another side. As Israel turned away from God and broke His law and defied His ways, the Shemitah was transformed from a sign of blessing into a sign of judgment.
In the year 586 BC, in the days of the prophet Jeremiah, the Shemitah came upon Israel in the form of judgment. The armies of Babylon overran the land. The city of Jerusalem was set on fire and razed to the ground. The land was left desolate as its people were taken captive into exile to Babylon. Jeremiah was given a prophetic revelation that the judgment would last 70 years.
Why 70 years? Because of the Shemitah. The covenant decreed that when judgment would come to Israel, the people would be removed from the land, and the land itself would rest. It would then observe its Sabbaths, its years of Shemitah. In other words, the timing and the duration of the judgment would be determined by the Shemitah. So now the land rested. There was no sowing or reaping or plowing or selling of its fruits. The nation had broken 70 Shemitah years, and for 70 years the judgment would last. So the Shemitah turns from a sign of blessing into a sign of judgment against a nation that has turned away from God, defied His ways, a sign of judgment that strikes the nation's sustenance, its blessings, its prosperity, its economic and financial realms. So whether in blessing or judgment, the Shemitah impacts and transforms the realms of economics, production, trade, labor, consumption, commerce, finance, credit, and debt. In judgment, the Shemitah could even determine a nation's existence or the lack of it.
Is it possible that the mystery of the Shemitah could still be in effect, even in the modern world, even today? Is it possible that God could use its pattern to determine the course of human history, to speak through it, to show the marks of His hand? Could the ancient mystery that begins on Mount Sinai still be affecting world history and our lives? And could it be that at certain times, as in the Bible, that the Shemitah has manifested in the modern world as a sign of judgment?
If the phenomenon of the Shemitah were to reappear in modern times, how would it manifest? The Shemitah causes economic cessation and financial nullification. In the modern world, when a nation's economic realm experiences cessation or diminishing, it's called a recession or a depression. And when a nation experiences financial nullifying, the wiping out of financial accounts, It's called a financial collapse or the crashing of stock markets. Could the ancient mystery be affecting these realms to this day? In the last 40 years, there have been 5 major turning points in the financial realm when the stock market reaches its long-term peak and begins a long-term collapse.
The years of these turning points, these peaks, these collapses are these: 1973, 1980, 1987, 2000, 2007. Is there anything peculiar or strange about these years? The Shemitah affects the financial and economic realms and takes place on a 7-year cycle. The first and second turning point, 1973 and 1980. That's a 7-year cycle. The second and third turning point, 1980 and 1987. Another 7-year cycle. The fourth and fifth turning point, 2000 and 2007. Another 7-year cycle. The Shemitah ordains a financial nullifying to take place according to a 7-year cycle or mystery.
In the past 40 years, every single major financial turning point has taken place according to a 7-year cycle from the preceding or following financial collapse. Beyond this 7-year cycle, do any of these 5 major collapses have any connection to the year of the Shemitah? The answer is yes. How many of them? Every single one of them. The year 1973 was the year of the Shemitah. The year 1980, the year of the Shemitah. The year 1987, year of the Shemitah. The year 2000, year of the Shemitah. The year 2007, the year of the Shemitah. 100% of the crashes take place not only according to a 7-year cycle, but also according to the specific 7-year cycle ordained in the Bible, the biblical Shemitah.
Though the phenomenon may increase or lessen, or may not be apparent in a given cycle, what about the Shemitah of 1994? Was there anything significant that took place that year regarding the financial realm? Could there have been any collapse?
The answer is yes. During the Shemitah of 1994, the other side of the financial market collapses, the bond market. In fact, it was called the Great Bond Market Massacre of 1994, and the greatest bond market collapse in history up to that moment. That collapse wiped away $600 billion in U.S. bonds, and a total of $1.5 trillion worldwide.
Now what happens if we expand the search and look at the greatest long-term financial collapses in modern history, from the turn of the 20th century to the 21st? Do any of the greatest crashes take place at the time of the biblical Shemitah?
The answer is again yes. How many? The majority of them. Only a minority happen outside the biblical Shemitah. Of the top 3 greatest collapses of modern history, how many take place during the Shemitah? 100% of them.
The third greatest crash is that of 1937 to 1938. 1937 to 1938 is the year of the biblical Shemitah. The second greatest crash in history was the Great Recession, the global financial collapse. It begins in the year 2007 and sees its most dramatic crash in the year 2008. 2007 to 2008 is the biblical year of the Shemitah. The greatest crash in history is the Great Depression. Its critical and peak period is that of 1930 to 1931. 1930 to 1931 is the year of the biblical Shemitah.
What happens if we take a closer look? In September of 1937, the Shemitah begins. The very next day, Wall Street collapses. In September of 1931, the Shemitah reaches its peak day. What follows is the greatest month-long percentage crash in stock market history.
In the section of the book entitled The Mystery of Cataclysms, Kahn reveals the phenomenon's link to the Hebrew month of Tishri. Tishri is the most sacred of Hebrew months, and it holds a unique connection to the Shemitah. The month of Tishri ushers in the Shemitah and crowns its conclusion.
The Shemitah begins and ends with the month of Tishri. When the Shemitah year reaches its peak at the sunset of Elul 29, the moment of financial nullification, when financial accounts are wiped away, that same moment, that same sunset, ushers in the beginning of Tishri. So that Tishri marks the Shemitah's culmination, and it's the same month that most dramatically manifests the repercussions of that financial nullification. Now, what happens if instead of looking at the greatest long-term collapses in history, we look at the greatest single-day crashes in history, when the greatest percentage of wealth is wiped out in a single day? Do any of these crashes take place around the time of Tishri? Of the top 10 of these crashes, the odds of these focusing on one single month out of 12 would be slightly less than 1 in 10. So what's the answer? Of the greatest single-day crashes in stock market history, the majority of them cluster around this single solitary month of Tishri. In fact, the majority of these crashes take place in a space of time that in the biblical calendar is only 2.5 weeks long. That's over 1,000 percentage points higher than what should naturally take place. And which 2.5 weeks are they? The 2.5 weeks centered on the biblical month of Tishri.
For ages, financial analysts have been mystified by a phenomenon they couldn't explain. It was the phenomenon of the greatest crashes in stock market history, all clustering around one particular time of the year, the autumn, and specifically the period of September and October. One explanation after the next was offered up, but it never answered the mystery. But the mystery of the Shemitah gives the answer. Autumn is the time appointed by God in the Bible for the nullifying of the financial realm.
And the period of September-October is the biblical month of Tishri, the very month that manifests the nullifying of the financial realm appointed in the Bible.
Now what happens if we look not at the greatest stock market percentage crashes in history, but at the greatest stock market point or volume crashes in history? Do any of these greatest crashes take place in proximity to the biblical day of financial nullifying, Elul 29? And not just Elul 29, but the Elul 29 that takes place only once in 7 years. A stock market crash can take place at any time within a 7-year period.
What is the proximity of the 5 greatest point crashes in stock market history to the once in 7-year biblical day of financial nullifying? The 5th greatest stock market point crash in history. Proximity to the biblical day of financial nullification, 99.6%. The 4th greatest stock market point crash, its proximity to the biblical day of financial wipeout, 97.5%. The 3rd greatest stock market point crash in history, its proximity to the Bible's day of financial nullifying, 100%. The 2nd greatest stock market point crash, its proximity to the biblical day of nullification, 99.3%. And the 1st greatest stock market point crash in history, its proximity to the Bible's appointed day of financial nullification, 100%. The average proximity and convergence of the 5 greatest stock market point crashes in history to the Shemitah's once in 7 years day of nullification, 99.3%. Of the 5 greatest crashes in American history, the proportion taking place either in the wake of the Shemitah's 7-year climax or at that moment of climax itself is 100%.
The phenomenon of the Shemitah not only lies behind the economic and financial realms, but the mystery is so big, it affects the ascending and the collapsing of nations. The Hebrew word Shemitah can be translated as the release, but it can also mean the shaking, the fall, even the collapse. In 586 BC, the phenomenon of the Shemitah wipes away not only financial accounts, but also an entire nation, the Kingdom of Judah. It also determines the rise and the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the rising of the Persian Empire. In the section of the book entitled The Rise and Fall of Nations, Jonathan Cahn reveals how the Shemitah has been linked to the shaking of nations and has been determining the greatest transformations of world history.
In the early part of the 20th century, the greatest shaking of nations the world had ever seen takes place with the coming of the First World War. The key turning point of that war was the year 1917. 1917 was the year of the Shemitah. As the Shemitah can mean the fall or the collapse, 1917 was the year that one of the oldest empires on earth, the Russian Empire, collapses. It would lead to the formation of the Soviet Union. In that same year comes another turning point in world history. America breaks out of its isolation and enters the First World War. That entrance would ultimately lead to even more collapses of powers. Before the war is over, 3 more empires would collapse. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the centuries-old Ottoman Turkish Empire. As the Shemitah involves nullification, so the war's climax would bring the nullification of powers, of kingdoms, even of landscapes.
The Shemitah brings the fall of powers, but also the rise of other powers. The Shemitah of 1917, with America's entrance into the war, marks the beginning of America's rise to world military and political superpower. In that year, the British Empire, in debt to America, reaches a state of near bankruptcy. But on the other side of the Atlantic, America would become the greatest creditor nation in the world, replacing Great Britain. The world's financial center departs from London and Europe and switches to New York.
America becomes the center of the world's financial system. Now what happens if we move 4 Shemitahs 28 years into the future? We are brought to the Shemitah of 1945, the peak year of the second great shaking of nations and the second great global cataclysm, the Second World War.
The conflict of the Second World War begins in 1938 when Hitler seizes Austria and Czechoslovakia. 1938 is the biblical year of the Shemitah, and it begins a 7-year biblical cycle, 1938 to 1945. The world cataclysm will follow the biblical cycle of the Shemitah.
As the year of the Shemitah, 1944 to 1945, approaches, the Second World War reaches its peak. Again, the Shemitah brings the falling of powers, the collapsing of empires, and the nullifying of landscapes. And it builds up to the greatest power of nullification the world had ever seen, with the dropping of the atomic bomb. The 7-year cycle and the year of the Shemitah reach their end in the first week of September 1945. That very same week, the Second World War reaches its end.
The war is sealed by the victors' procession in the streets of Berlin days after the surrender of the Japanese Empire. It is the only procession that will take place at the war's conclusion, sealing the Second World War.
The date of that procession is September 7th, 1945. That's Elul 29, the Shemitah's climactic day, and the very day that ends the 7-year biblical cycle. The Shemitah brings the collapse of the great European colonial empires and the beginning of a new world order and the rise of the 2 superpowers. It brings America to its greatest pinnacle of relative power as the world's preeminent superpower. And a new world financial order comes into being called Bretton Woods, in which the currencies of the nations are now based on the American dollar. but the Shemitah also can mean the fall. Now, if we move forward by 4 Shemitahs again, we come to another critical year and the year of another falling. It is the Shemitah of 1973. At its outset, America makes a fateful decision to legalize the killing of its unborn children. That same month, its financial realm begins its long-term collapse and will lead into a global recession. That same year of the Shemitah, the post-World War II financial order, Bretton Woods, begun in the Shemitah of 1945 and based on the American dollar, irrevocably collapses. And that same year, America suffers its first military defeat in modern history as it loses the war in Vietnam. The date it suffers that first defeat, August 15th, is significant. It is the same date, August 15th, on which America had won its greatest victory, the Second World War, in the Shemitah of 1945.
The Shemitah can mean the shaking. From 1973, moving forward 4 Shemitahs into the future, it brings us to the year, the Shemitah of 2001. As that Shemitah reaches its climax in its very last climactic week, the time of nullifying, it brings in 9/11.
As the Shemitah can mean the fall, so comes the fall, literally, of the towers, the symbols of America's power and prosperity. As the Shemitah can mean the collapse, so the towers collapse to the ground, and a new era begins with the Shemitah.
In biblical Hebrew, the word for tower is migdal. Migdal comes from the Hebrew root word gadal, which can mean to be made great, to be enlarged, to be magnified. It can also mean pride. The link between towers and greatness forms the background of a section in the book Kahn calls The Mystery of the Towers. It has to do with the connection between the rise of towers and the rising of kingdoms.
The very first tower mentioned in the Bible, that of Babel, is linked to man's attempt to attain greatness and glory.
It's written, they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower." The tower is to be the epitome, the embodiment of a civilization. Could the rising of high towers be linked to the rise of kingdoms, civilizations, powers?
Up to the 19th century, the greatest towers or high buildings on earth rose out of the soil of Europe. But in the year 1870, that all changed. 1870 was the year of the completion of the world's first skyscraper. It rose not in the old world, but in the new. It rose up in New York City. It would be the tallest secular building on earth. Could its rising have marked a change in world power? The year the tower rose was 1870. 1870 marks the beginning year of the Gilded Age, the period of America's rising as the world's strongest industrial power. In 1871, the very next year after the tower ascended, a momentous change took place in world history. The British Empire would be eclipsed. America would become the strongest economic power on earth. From that time forward, the world's highest towers would ascend from American soil, higher and higher, paralleling America's continual rise on the world stage. The tower speaks of rising, but the Shemitah speaks of a fall. Towers speak of a nation's glory, but the Shemitah speaks of a nation's humbling. America reaches its moment of greatest supremacy relative to the rest of the world in the year 1945. At that same moment in history, a tower is conceived. It's to embody America's new global preeminence. It would be called the World Trade Center. It would epitomize the new American-based world order. The tower is conceived in 1945. 1945 is the year of the Shemitah. Its construction begins in the year 1966. 1966 is the year of the Shemitah. Its building would take 7 years to complete. Those 7 years constitute the 7-year cycle of the biblical Shemitah. It is finished and dedicated in 1973. 1973 is the biblical year of the Shemitah.
So the tower is conceived in the year of the Shemitah, 1945, begun in the year of the Shemitah, 1966, completed in the year of the Shemitah, 1973, and then in the year of the Shemitah, 2001, it is destroyed.
Towers speak of the rising, the power, the glory of kingdoms. But the Shemitah speaks of the fall of nations and the humbling of a nation's glory. In the year of the Shemitah, at its climactic last week and peak, the towers of a nation's glory fall to the earth. At the Shemitah's time of nullifying, the towers are nullified. And it was shortly before the year 2001 that something momentous happened in world history. As the 20th century came to an end, the age that had begun in 1871 also came to an end.
America's days of boasting the highest towers on earth were over. It had been eclipsed by others. Now the highest towers on earth rose from Asia.
We've seen a connection between the rising of towers and the rising of kingdoms. But if the rise of high towers speak of the rise of nations, then of what does the fall of a tower speak or foreshadow? It all took place in the climactic days of the Shemitah of 2001. The warning of the Shemitah is this: a nation's blessings, its prosperity, its sustenance comes from God alone. If a nation greatly blessed by God should drive God out of its life and defy Him and war against His ways, then those blessings, that prosperity, and that sustenance will be removed. And in the case of a civilization that has reigned as head of nations, the crown it has borne will be removed.
Near the end of the book is a chapter entitled The Mystery of the Seventh Shemitah. In it, the Shemitah reveals the timing of the key events of end-time prophecy. Every 7 years in ancient Israel was the Shemitah, but every 49 years was the seventh Shemitah. The seventh Shemitah carries its own significance because it ushers in what the Bible calls the year of Jubilee.
The Jubilee is based on the Shemitah. It is, in effect, a super Shemitah. The Jubilee was the year of liberty and restoration. During the Jubilee, those in bondage were released, set free. During the Jubilee, if you had lost your land, it would be restored. If you had lost your family inheritance, it would be given back. If you had lost the house of your fathers in the Jubilee, you'd come home.
As it was written, everyone shall return to his family and to his possession. The Jubilee was the year of being restored to what was lost, regaining one's ancestral possession, returning home. Because of the lack of historical records of the Jubilee's celebration in the Second Temple period, we can't say with certainty when the Jubilee takes place. But we do know the timing of the Shemitah, and we do know that the Jubilee must take place in the year following the Shemitah, specifically the seventh Shemitah. So could the mystery of the Shemitah open up a revelation concerning end-time events, even a prophetic Jubilee of restoration?
It is the Shemitah of September 1916 to September 1917. The Jubilee concerns the year after the Shemitah. The year after the Shemitah begins September 1917, ends September 1918. Could there have been a prophetic restoration within those dates, in those parameters, in the year after the Shemitah? The answer is yes, and it's an amazing one.
The Jewish people had lost the land of Israel, their homeland, in 70 AD. For 2,000 years, they wandered the earth. The Bible foretells that one of the key events of the end times would be the return of the Jewish people, their restoration, to their ancient homeland, Israel.
1917, year of the Shemitah, brings the collapsing of the Ottoman Empire. It just so happens that the Ottoman Empire is the power that holds the land of Israel and has held it for 400 years.
The British Empire, under General Allenby, is advancing on the land. In November of that year, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration declares that the land of Israel would be given to the Jewish people as a national homeland.
It's the first time in 2,000 years that the land is being restored to the Jewish people. The year following the Shemitah was September 1917 to September 1918. The Balfour Declaration takes place in November 1917. Thus, the land is restored to the Jewish people in the year following the Shemitah, corresponding to the Jubilee. It's a prophetic Jubilee, and according to the mystery, the Jewish people now would return home to the land they had lost, to their father's possession, to their ancestral homeland. Everyone shall return to their possession. The mystery of the Jubilee concerns the seventh Shemitah. So what happens if we move forward in time from the Shemitah of 1917, 49 years to come to the seventh Shemitah? What is the seventh Shemitah? It brings us to the Shemitah of September 1965 to September 1966. The year following the Shemitah would begin September 1966 and end September 1967. Did anything significant take place within that year and within those dates? Any event of restoration? The answer is yes. According to Bible prophecy, the Jewish people have to be restored not only to their homeland, but also to their ancient holy city of Jerusalem. In the midst of the Six-Day War, Israeli soldiers enter the Lion's Gate of the biblical city of Jerusalem. Through gunfire, they make their way to the holiest site in Judaism, the Western Wall. There they weep. And after 2,000 years, the Jewish people are restored to their ancient capital, Jerusalem. It happens on June 7th, 1967. Within the parameters of the year ending in September 1967, the year following the seventh Shemitah, the Jubilee. The seventh Shemitah had ushered in the second restoration of the land. According to the mystery of the seventh Shemitah, the Jewish people had returned to what they lost 2,000 years before, Jerusalem. They had regained their long-lost possession and returned to their ancestral home. The two great restorations of the land each happened according to the mystery.
The Bible ordains that in the year of the Jubilee, the shofar, the ram's horn, is to be sounded. The first thing that happens after the soldiers reached the Temple Mount in 1967 is that the ram's horn is sounded from the Temple Mount, the sound of the Jubilee.
The man who sounds it is Rabbi Shlomo Goren. Rabbi Goren was born in the year 1917, the time of the other restoration. When he sounds the shofar, he is 50 years old, the number of the Jubilee.
The mystery of the Shemitah lies behind the two great end-time restorations of Israel's lands. Now, the pattern and cycle does not have to continue, but if it did, what would be the seventh Shemitah from the last restoration?
The seventh Shemitah begins September 2014, goes to September 2015. The year following the seventh Shemitah is that of September 2015 to September 2016. While the cycle doesn't have to continue and nothing significant has to take place, in the last two occurrences, It has meant war in the Middle East, war in the land of Israel, and a war resulting in a prophetic restoration.
In its last two manifestations, the phenomenon of the Shemitah has appeared to have intensified and strengthened. Its intensification has been so great that it's involved nothing less than the greatest financial collapses in world history. The Shemitah began in September 2000. The following month, American production begins to fall. Within a few months more, the nation is in a recession. As the Shemitah approaches its peak, it's September 2001. A calamity strikes. September 11th. The calamity causes Wall Street to shut down for the rest of the week.
The following Monday, it reopens. That day is historic. It is the greatest point collapse in stock market and Wall Street history up to that day. Fortunes are wiped out. Accounts are wiped clean. On what day did this greatest collapse in stock market history take place? The date is September 17th, 2001. But on the Hebrew biblical calendar, that day carries a different name. The greatest stock market collapse takes place on the 29th day of Elul, the exact day appointed from ancient times for the nullifying of the financial realm, the wiping out of financial accounts. Elul 29, the day of the Shemitah, the sign of judgment against a nation that has driven God out of its life and pursued idols and material gain. The judgment that specifically strikes the nation's economic and financial realm. That greatest financial collapse in history, that record would hold for several years until a greater crash would come. The stock market had been rising for several years after the financial depths that followed 9/11. And then comes the next Shemitah. It is September 2007. Within 1 month of its beginning, the stock market's momentum begins to reverse. The ascent is over. It begins to fall. The fall continues until the Shemitah reaches its peak in September 2008, when the fall turns into an epic global financial collapse. The collapse reaches its peak at the end of September 2008, with what becomes the greatest single-day crash in Wall Street history.
That morning, in the New York Stock Exchange, the opening bell refuses to sound. Even Wall Street takes it as an omen. The stock market crashes over 700 points. On what date did the greatest crash in Wall Street history take place?
It is September 29th, 2008. But the ancient biblical calendar holds a different name. The greatest stock market collapse in world history takes place on the 29th day of Elul, the exact day appointed from ancient times for the nullifying of the financial realm, the wiping out of financial accounts. Elul 29, the day of the Shemitah, the sign of judgment against a nation that has driven God out of its life. The judgment that specifically strikes the nation's economic and financial realm. The two greatest collapses in stock market history up to those dates each took place on the same exact day on the ancient biblical calendar. And they just happened to each take place on the precise biblical day that's specifically ordained to touch the nation's financial realm and to wipe clean its financial accounts from ancient times, the day of financial nullifying. And it's not only Elul 29, but it can only be one Elul 29 in 7 years that can constitute the day of the Shemitah, the day of nullification. So on which Elul 29 did the greatest stock market collapse take place in the year 2008? It happened on the once in 7 years Elul 29, the exact one that constitutes the day of the Shemitah, and the greatest crash of 2001. When did it take place? It happened on the once in 7 years of Elul 29 that also constituted the Bible's day of the Shemitah. So when all across the world, observant Jews are symbolically canceling out their debts to each other, the greatest wiping out of financial accounts in history is taking place on Wall Street and sweeping across the globe. According to the ancient mystery, the financial nullification has to take place 7 years apart from the one before or after. So the two greatest financial nullifications in Wall Street history up to their dates take place 7 years apart. Not only on Elul 29, but 7 years apart. 7 exact biblical years apart, down to the exact season, the exact month, the exact date, the exact hour, the exact minute, the exact second, the exact closing bell. No human hand in the world could have orchestrated such a thing. It required the working together of every financial transaction and interaction in the world. It even required that 9/11 had to have happened exactly when it did, as it was 9/11 that caused Wall Street to collapse in 2001 on the exact ancient appointed day.
The Shemitah is a mystery based on the number 7. In the chapter entitled The Mystery of Sevens, Kahn points out the striking appearance of the number 7 in the two crashes. Each takes place on the day marking the climactic end of the 7th year and the 7-year cycle.
The mark of the Shemitah is the number 7. In the crash of 2001, the percentage of Wall Street that was wiped out was 7%. In the crash of 2008, the portion wiped out of Wall Street was 7%. In 2008, by the time the closing bell rings on the greatest point crash in history and the biblical day of nullification, the peak of the 7th year, the number of points wiped out, nullified, comes out to 777. The sign of the Shemitah had again appeared to a nation in rapid departure from God. In its appearance is a warning. America's blessings come from God. No nation can wage war against the source of its blessings and expect those blessings to remain. If America does not return to God, then according to the mystery, the American age, as we know it, will come to an end.
Jonathan Cahn is inevitably asked as to what lies ahead. The book contains a section concerning that which lies ahead. In it, he deals with the signs and patterns by which the dynamics of the Shemitah manifest, as well as dates. But Cahn will always first issue 2 cautions. The first is that we cannot be dogmatic and cannot place God in a box. Nothing has to happen in any given Shemitah. The mystery doesn't have to manifest every cycle. It can be lesser in one and greater in another. The second caution is this: it can happen, and one should be aware and ready if it does. The pattern when the dynamics of the Shemitah manifest is that they tend to do so not so much at the Shemitah's beginning, but at its end as it approaches its autumn climax. Cahn has often warned that if America does not turn back to God, its crown as head of nations will be removed.
In the very first weeks of the Shemitah that began in September 2014, a momentous change took place. The crown that America had borne since 1871, as noted in the book, as the strongest economic power on earth, was removed. A new nation had eclipsed America and taken away its crown: China.
Cahn has noted that in this current year of the Shemitah, the climactic day, Elul 29, will take place during a solar eclipse. The last time these two events converged, it led into Black Monday, the worst stock market percentage crash in history. America's apostasy from God has not stopped or slowed down, but it has continued and quickened. Regardless of whether it takes place within the parameters of the Shemitah or beyond, Khan believes a great shaking is coming to America and the world, one that will dramatically impact the economic realm, the financial realm, and yet not limited to those realms. When Khan is asked if America's future holds judgment or revival, he answers that it can be both, that revival can be birthed in judgment. At the end of the book is a chapter entitled The Last Shemitah. In it, Khan brings the Shemitah to its ultimate conclusion.
There is a day appointed for every person when all that they know, all that they've known will collapse. A day when, as in the Shemitah, the sovereignty of God will be manifested over everything. This will be the final Shemitah, when earthly life is finished and we each stand before God on the day of judgment in light of eternity. How do we prepare for such a day? How does one prepare for the coming of judgment on earth? The same way. There's only one way to prepare. That is, to get your life right with God. In Hebrew, the word for safety is Yeshua, and Yeshua is the real name of Jesus. Outside of Him, there's no safety, but inside of Him, there's no fear. The key is to get your life inside Him. And the only way to get inside, according to the Bible, according to His own words, is to be born again. He said, you must be born again or you cannot enter heaven. You need to take the time you have more seriously. The hour is late. And the time for getting right isn't tomorrow, it's now. If there's anything in your life that's not in the will of God, get it out now. Don't say tomorrow, do it now. If there's anything that should be in your life, that God is calling you to, but it's not in your life, don't say I'll do it tomorrow, do it now. Whatever isn't grounded on God will be shaken and will fall. Therefore, this is a call to ground yourself all the more, ground your life all the more strongly on the Word of God. One thing that the Shemitah strongly shows us is that no matter what it looks like, no matter how out of control it seems, God is in control. And for the one who is in God, there is no reason for fear but peace. As it is written, though the earth be moved and the mountains fall into the midst of the sea, though the waters roar and be troubled, and the mountains shake with swelling, we will not fear, for God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Everything that can be shaken shall be shaken. But for those who place their trust, their hope, their will, and their lives in God and in His will, they shall never be shaken.